Welcome to my talk, the soprano saxophone adapted to different tone generators in comparison to their prototype instruments. My name is Jonas Braasch and I'm from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. In Western music, we primarily classify our wind instruments based on their tone generator types. This is a classification system that was developed by von Hornbostel and Sachs, and it's still valid today. And you see here from left to right the different tone generator types, from flutes, double reed instruments, single reed instruments, free reed instruments, which are not very common in European orchestras, and then also you have the brass winds and the brass instruments. And on the y-axis we have the change in time. On the bottom, prehistoric instruments to early instruments, Baroque, Romantic instruments. And what is important here to note is that most orchestral instruments that we know today were developed, or at least further developed, in the 19th century when orchestras grew and became what they are today. So let's talk about the flutes first. So with the flutes, you have the rim flute. That's the oldest instrument we know, a 40,000-year-old flute found in the Hohlefels cave. And then from there we developed other rim flutes, the recorder, which has a duct system to guide the airflow to hit before it hits the tone edge. And then of course we have the transverse flutes as we know it today. And here are two examples. One of them is a modern recorder, and the other one is the Turkish ney, which is basically a wind instrument that is played at the edge on the rim. So it's a very early mechanism. Going to the double reed instruments, the oldest double reed instrument that's probably still in existence is the Armenian duduk. Has a very large reed. We will talk more about it later. And then we also have the shorn, which was basically the predecessor to the oboe. And then from the oboe we have the sarrusophone, which is basically like a saxophone and oboe with a metal body, as the saxophone is a clarinet instrument, except that the sarrusophone and the oboe, they are both conical instruments. And here you have a photo of the sarrusophone, which will become important during the talk. And then we have the single reeds. We have the chameau, which is the predecessor to the clarinet. And the saxophone was developed somewhat out of the clarinet, but it has a conical body, a similar mouthpiece, and it sounds through the conical body very different from the cylindrical clarinet. And then we have the free reed instrument family, which mainly comes from Asia. We have, for example, the bouvou that you see here. And the bouvou's reed is smaller than the frame. The reed swings freely through the frame, and that's why it calls a free reed instrument. And it is fundamentally different from a Western reed instrument, where the reed either hits the frame every cycle or two reeds hit each other. The brass instruments, I just want to point out one instrument here, and that's the cornet, and the Renaissance cornet. And the Renaissance cornet has a conical body and then finger holes like a recorder and a brass mouthpiece. And so my idea was, can I take those different instruments and instead of creating an instrument family characterized by an instrument that has the same principle but different sizes, kind of a instrument sibling group where you have a similar size and resonator but different tone generators. So I took the saxophone and extended it to what I call the hyper specialized saxophone, and it now connects to different tone generators. And in my talk today I want to explore to which extent can I play these instruments and how do they sound compared to original prototype instruments. I wrote a book about this last year which appeared at Springer. And on the right you see here different tone generators I adapted to the saxophone by either using different necks or adapting the different necks. And here you see from left to right a bouvou adapter, a bassoon reed adapter, which makes it the sarrusophone. Then you have the original saxophones and a cornetto mouthpiece. And on the bottom, that's my instrument, is called the pocket didgeridoo, which is basically a set of 6 PVC pipes that are all connected through 180 degrees connector. And so you can generate very low notes up down to 50 hertz on the saxophone. And on the bottom right you see an adapted duduk reed. So I want to give you a quick idea how those instruments sound, so they're all in a kind of quick loop as a round robin. I did my analysis, I was inspired by a paper by Arthur Bennett called Woodwinds, The Revolutionary Past Since 1700. And the paper appeared 1994 in the Galpin Society, and the idea was that after 1700, instruments were modified such that they were much easier to play in tune, and much better to play in balance. So, and I wanted to look, because some of my prototypes actually precede 1700, how this would work in connection with the saxophone. I took single recording measurements. Usually I took the tone C4, G4, B flat 4, C5, G5, and C6. And I recorded everything with an AKG microphone. It was then amplified with a Soundcraft Delta console and recorded using a Motu 2408 interface. And all instruments were recorded such that the microphone was placed about 30 centimeters from the bell, so 20 centimeters above it. And except the flute instruments, there we recorded about 15 centimeters above the tone edge, with 8 centimeters being off axis. And all sound analysis was done using MATLAB. So I want to focus primarily on the timbre of the instruments, but I have to say that you can hear out the different tone generators, and here, for examples, these are spectrograms from the onset part. On the top left, you have the soprano saxophone mouthpiece, and you see that the onset phase is characterized by the overtones successively coming in from bottom to top, and that's very similar to the bassoon reed if you mount it to the saxophone. And the cornet mouthpiece is a little bit different in the sense, first of all, it's an outward striking mechanism rather than an inward striking mechanism. And a succession of the overtones is much slower. And typically, the pitch also in the initial phase goes from higher pitch to lower pitch. Very briefly, you don't hear it as a pitch change, but rather as a tonal characteristic. And the bavou has this typical sound of a free reed instrument that you can definitely hear on. So let's look at the different instruments. First, I would like to compare the Renaissance cornet with the modified saxophone. I call it the Böhm cornet because it's basically a Renaissance cornet with a metal body and a key system like you find for Böhm fingering systems. And here's how they sound. So if you look at the tone spectra, on the left you see the cornet, on the right you see the Böhm cornet, on the top is C4 compared to C5 on the bottom, and you see that in principle the tonal characteristics are well preserved. So for the C4, the fundamental dominates, but you still have a fair amount of higher harmonics that change similar. They roll off slightly, but in a similar way between both instruments. If you go then to the C5, you see that you have more formant focus on a higher harmonic, third, second and third. But in both cases, you see the changes. You see also the changes going from C4 to C5. Those differences are fairly similar between both instruments. Now let's look at the oboe compared to the sarrusophone. The sarrusophone in this case is my modified saxophone. It is wider than an original sarrusophone. I wish I could compare my saxophone sarrusophone to an original sarrusophone, but those instruments are very difficult to get a hand on. So I took an orchestral oboe. On the left, you see the oboe spectra, again for C4 and C5. On the right, you see the sarrusophone. And here you see they're fundamentally different because the sarrusophone is much wider. It also doesn't have an oboe reed, because the reed would be too small to couple properly with the resonator. So you see the oboe has a higher harmonics, or the centroid at higher harmonics, while the sousaphone really focuses on the fundamental sound. The higher harmonics roll much quicker off, so you have a much darker sound. And that's what we heard also in the demonstration. So the next graph shows the flute. On the left you see the ney, and on the right you see the saxophone played as a rim flute. And so here we compare the two notes C5 and C6, because you can get the C4 on the saxophone rim flute. And you see, even though they have very different bodies, both instruments, the ney being cylindrical, this rim saxophone flute being conical, they still have fairly similar overtone structures, because as is typical for flutes, you don't have many higher harmonics. The next one is the bavou compared to the saxophone bavou. On the left, the bavou, in this case C4 again, and C5. On the right, you have the saxophone. And you see, even though their resonator is fundamentally different shape, the bavou has a cylindrical body, the saxophone has a conical body, which is much wider. The spectra look fairly similar, and the reason for this, I believe, is the reed has the dominant sound characteristic that it carries on. The next instrument we have is the duduk, compared to the saxophone with the duduk reed. Even though both instruments share exactly the same tone generator, they sound fundamentally different. The duduk has a very narrow body compared to the size of the reed, so the fundamental tone is pronounced, and the higher partials have almost no energy. The soprano saxophone with the duduk, on the other hand, looks more like a spectrum of a saxophone. So here you see the most pronounced harmonic is actually the second harmonic, and it rolls off, but you have much more energy in the higher harmonics, independent of whether you play the C4 or the C5. So now I would like to conclude with the observations. In all cases, you can hear out the instrument tone generator. So when we classify instruments, you can hear out that this is a brass instrument now, or a double reed. It's not that we imitate the sound of a brass instrument, but the saxophone actually becomes a brass instrument by putting a cornet mouthpiece onto the saxophone. All instruments can be played in tune, but some of them are harder to play in tune and to play balanced, and this is really in line with the paper that Arthur Bennett wrote. And if you look at the Böhm cornet, which is basically inspired from the Renaissance cornet, that of course is still an instrument that precedes 1700. In some cases, the instrument saxophone or the saxophone adapted instruments sound very similar to the original prototypes. That's the case for the cornet, that's the case for the ney and the bavou, but in other cases both instruments, the saxophone and the adapted saxophone instruments, sound very different.